Book is called Brit-ish, that's Brit-ish in brackets, and it's about Britishness and identity. It's a narrative non-fiction book that argues that Britishness is an identity in crisis. And I draw on my own life experience to make that point, but I also tell the story of other people who feel excluded from Britishness. And I look at the reasons that race is really a taboo subject in Britain, why we have skirted around the issues of really addressing why we are a multicultural society, why there are so many people who are entitled to Britishness who are of colour but yet feel excluded. And I don't think that is our problem as people of colour. I think that is a problem for Britain. And I think it's manifested in very existential ways. If you look at Brexit, you look at the narrative around immigration, Britain is in the grip of something that derives from its inability to confront its past, but it doesn't understand that because it won't speak about it.
So why do you think it's such a big deal to speak about the past? What is it that people are so reluctant about when it comes to addressing some of their history? Because we're selective with the history that we rejoice. We love parts of it, but there's some parts of it that we just completely ignore. But the parts we ignore arguably are the most important. Yeah.
I have a theory. Britain won the First and Second World War. And there is a very strong narrative in Britain of a victorious, glorious nation. And it's true, Britain won the First and Second World War, and Britain defeated fascism, and that there was a huge moral integrity in having defeated Hitler and in standing against the evils that Hitler stood for. But the problem is that I think that British people have been so instilled with this narrative of victory. And just to put that in context, there are 50 TV documentary series every year about the Second World War in Britain. Every year. British people are brainwashed into this idea of victory. And not to detract from that, but the problem is that anything that contradicts an idea of being on the right side of history is immediately dismissed. And the problem is Britain presided over an empire that was based on a narrative of white supremacy, that helped invent transatlantic slavery, that dominated other people and cultures based on the idea that they didn't have the right to self-determination because they were genetically inferior. That's recent British history. That's arguably the most important part of British history. 400 years of empire that made Britain the global power it is today. And because acknowledging the wrongs of that story contradict the idea that we were on the right side of history, no one's willing to talk about it. So it's not taught in schools. There is no museum of empire in Britain. And when it comes to the remnants of empire, the Commonwealth, which everyone's very proud of, there's a real sense that we celebrate the Commonwealth because it enriches Britain, but we're not willing to tolerate its people. Just look at what happened with the Windrush generation. It's the classic example. At the very moment that the Commonwealth heads of state were there and everyone was waving flags and celebrating sport, the government was refusing to meet the heads of state from the Commonwealth to talk about the fact that British people were being deported. And that, for me, is symbolic of this idea that Britain is willing to still accept the benefits of having been an imperial power, but it doesn't want to deal with the people. And as a British person of colour, you live that contradiction, you live that hypocrisy. You sense that you are in this country for a reason, but that people still regard you as an outsider, even when you're British. And that was my lived experience, and I didn't have the tools to understand it growing up.
So is that where the inspiration came from, the drive to actually write this book and finish it?
Yes. Primarily my book was driven by the need to reach the younger me. And as a young person, I really was, and it's not like catastrophizing, say I had a real identity crisis. Because I was born, I'm mixed race, so I was born, my mother's black from Ghana, my father's white. And I was born into these two identities that were invented to be oppositional. In the sense that race doesn't exist, it was invented to help justify a narrative of racism. And so I think, and that's still such a present reality, that you are born into that, but nobody explains why. You perceive the tension between the two parts of your heritage, but there's no language to express it. There's no way of understanding it. And I lived it. And as I became a professional person and I started to educate myself, I really started to understand the roots of that contradiction. And I realized that there are other young people growing up in the same way. Not just mixed race people, anybody of colour in Britain or anybody who experiences multiple heritages that aren't spoken about. And I was determined to do whatever I could to help another generation not have to work it out the hard way. And so when I wrote my book, I didn't think it would reach a wider audience. I just wanted to reach the younger me. So it's been a huge and very affirming and wonderful surprise that it's really become a mainstream success, that so many people are interested in my book and my story.
Just touch on something you said. You said race is a made up, along the lines of race is a made up construct. Do you think that race is actually a tribal thing amongst people, and racism that racism is actually something that's made up, but race effectively is just something that's tribal, that we always see difference in people regardless, but it's how we treat them which is the made up thing.
So my book's called Brit-ish, on race, identity and belonging. And the reason there's such an emphasis on identity and belonging is because I think those are the foundational parts of the human experience. Every human society since the beginning of time has created an identity and a language and a kind of community. And by definition, to have an identity amongst yourselves, that means you are distinguishing among others and dividing, you can't have an identity unless there are others with a different identity. So that is a very fundamental human need. But that identity should be racial rather than, say, based on faith or language or region. That is a modern invention. That was from the 17th century. And the reason that race needed to be invented as a primary source of identity was to justify transatlantic slavery. Because if you think about it, it's very hard to convince rational people, God-fearing rational people, to treat human beings like animals. It requires a very powerful ideological basis, and race provided that. It was a very, very strong narrative, this idea that black people were closer to the animal species, that they didn't suffer in the same way, they didn't experience joy or intellectual awareness in the same way. It helped convince ordinary British people, ordinary Europeans, that it was okay not just to tolerate it, but to invest in it, to profit from it. And so there are greater biological differences within races than there are between them. Race does not exist as a question of science, but race does exist as a question of social reality, because it was created and we all live in the reality that has descended from that. And that's why my book is really pushing back against this idea that race isn't important. People in Britain like to say, oh, I don't see race. It's fine. And in my book, the way I deal with this is to say, I understand that what you're saying is well-intentioned. Often when people say they don't see race, what they're trying to do is distance themselves from that history of racism.
So they feel personally they're not racist.
Yes,
so.
and that's welcome, obviously. I welcome anyone who distances themselves from racism. But the problem is people mistakenly believe that race is a set of personal characteristics, that it's something you either see or don't see. That's not what race is. Race is a structure. Race is a system that has structured society over centuries. And by saying you don't see it, what you're doing is shutting your eyes to what exists around you and the racialized reality of others who are still suffering the oppression of race. And so you can't be part of the solution if you don't acknowledge the present.